now you are living in Amsterdam, is that it? Yeah?
I was until I see took down the Greenpeace and I just went back
And in South Africa you are living where?
Johannesburg, farm.
That's my favorite city.
Very nice. A pleasure to meet you. The reason why I say that she was in Yale was something on the invitation. Good. Did you enjoy it?
We're very glad. I was a graduate there many years ago. My daughter, 5 years ago.
Amazing library.
Terrific library.
Ladies and gentlemen, good afternoon and a very warm welcome. I'm Melinda Crane, and it will be my great pleasure to accompany you as a moderator throughout this afternoon. Our topic here is climate security and energy security. Is the heat still on? So if you're here for the NATO panel, unfortunately you are in the wrong room. But this is going to be a great panel, and I definitely urge you to stay. So a very warm welcome to everybody. Climate and energy security, is the heat still on? There is little doubt among experts that climate change is a threat multiplier, that it raises the risk of bad governance, and that it can well turn fragile states into failing ones. So are the crisis in Syria and the stream of refugees into Europe a harbinger of much more to come? Are climate security in the long run and energy security in the short to medium run compatible? And does the Paris Climate Change Agreement give us tools to make sure that we can take the heat off? Those are some of the things we want to talk about here on this panel today, and it's my great pleasure to introduce our guests. And first off, we have had a cancellation at short notice from Foreign Minister Laurent Fabius, who you probably know will not be Foreign Minister much longer, and therefore decided that he would not take part in the panel. But we're all the more grateful that we could persuade the President of Azerbaijan to jump in at very short notice and be with us here today. He is seated in the middle, President Ilham Aliyev. He has had the presidency since 2003, previously served as Prime Minister and Vice Chairman of the State Oil Company. A very warm welcome to you, sir. Great that you can be here. And next to him, here on your right from him is the Vice President of the European Commission and Commissioner for the Energy Union in charge of creating a single energy market in the EU. He is Slovakian diplomat Maroš Šefčovič, and he will be triangulating sustainability, affordability, and energy security. Not always an easy task. And seated on President Aliyev's other side, United States Senator Sheldon Whitehouse. He is known as being one of the Congress's toughest climate hawks. He's co-chairman and co-founder of the bicameral task force on climate change, and he also was the sponsor of the Carbon Fee Act in the face of formidable Republican opposition. And next to him, Oliver Bäte is CEO of Allianz SA and also a member of the Advisory Council of the Munich Security Council. He was one of the 79 CEOs who, in the run-up to the Paris climate talks, urged world leaders to take concrete action on climate change. And finally, a pleasure to welcome Kumi Naidoo. He was Greenpeace's International Executive Director from 2009 until December of last year, just in time to still allow him to take part in and hail the Paris Climate Agreement. He's from South Africa, and he is now back there heading the African Civil Society Center. So a very, very warm welcome to all of you. I would like to get us started with a very brief initial round that takes a look at the threat assessment, essentially asking for each of you to give us your brief take on what are the greatest security risks that we face due to climate change and which regions are most fragile. And Mr. President, I will start with you. You are already seeing in Azerbaijan desertification, floods, droughts. You share critical water resources with Armenia, with which you have, of course, had a long-running border dispute. Will climate stress exacerbate the geopolitical tensions in the Caucasus?
Of course, it's a common threat that we are all facing. As far as Azerbaijan is concerned, we managed to reduce gas emissions for the last 25 years of independence. In 1990, it was more than 70 million tons of emissions. Now it's something more than 50, despite the fact that our economy drastically grew during this period of time. But of course, there are challenges, there are threats. Particularly for us, of course, the main threat is that our main rivers, which supply water to us, come from neighboring country. And there is a very severe pollution, particularly in Armenia, of Aras River, which is a threat to all of us. And despite all our appeals to stop polluting the river, unfortunately, Armenia continues this policy. And as you correctly mentioned, we are suffering from aggression and occupation for more than 20 years. Almost 20% of our territory is under occupation, and apart from suffering to the people, our nature is suffering, because on these territories, which are completely beyond any international control, there is a lot of illegal activity, particularly deforestification. Because that part is very famous for its ancient trees and forests, and now they've been cut for commercial purposes. We are planting trees. We plant millions of trees every year. We continue policy of gasification, and today we use mainly gas and hydro for power generation. And this is our contribution. Though Azerbaijan is not, doesn't have any obligations under the Kyoto Protocol, our commitment is very strong, and I think that performance which we showed during the years of independence shows that we are a reliable partner in this process.
Just a brief follow-up. Does the prospect of coming water shortages in that very crucial Kura-Arax basin, is that impelling greater cooperation with Armenia on shared management of those resources?
Of course, we would like to have more understanding with the country which continues occupation, and I can tell you that very recently in January, Parliamentary Assembly of the Council of Europe adopted a resolution denouncing Armenia for creating problems with the water supply to the neighboring regions. And in this resolution, which was adopted by the majority of the Parliamentary Assembly, there is an appeal to Armenia to stop actually torturing people who suffer, because the water storage which is situated in Nagorno-Karabakh, which was built during the times when Nagorno-Karabakh was part of Azerbaijan de facto. Unfortunately, they're using it for purposes of creating problems to civilian population. And of course, Kura-Aras water supplies for us are critical. Though we built a pipeline which is bringing water from our mountains to Baku city, and we are now less dependent on the neighborhood. But still, for us, it's a serious problem. Though we have a big reservoir, like a Caspian Sea, and we already started the pilot project of desalinification of the Caspian Sea in order to use it for irrigation and later on for purpose of drinking water.
Thank you very much. Vice President Šefčovič, what do you see as the main risks coming from climate change for Europe? As we discussed yesterday evening here at the conference, we're not doing too well at the moment managing the enormous influx of refugees. Aren't we likely to see that number rise exponentially if, in fact, drought and sea level rise do take on the proportions that have been predicted?
to tell the truth, it would very much depend on us and on how successful we would be to fight climate change, how serious we would be with respecting our Paris agreements, and how fast we would be and successful we would be in the implementation. What I see as a major change, if I compare the situation of today with the situation, let's say, 5 to 10 years ago, today we have very strong public opinion supporting fight against climate change. I think it was one of the crucial factors why we managed to have these historic agreements. Why? Unfortunately, it took us quite too many of the natural weather-related disasters, droughts in Africa, hurricanes in the States, floods which we have never seen in Central Europe, the severe storms in Asia, to just show our mankind that what kind of human suffering, what amount of human loss, what kind of material damages the climate change is causing, that it's not just the weather, that it has the price and very often the ultimate price. And therefore I think that we really have to work with this mobilized public opinion to fight climate change globally. For Europe, of course, we see the changes in Europe. I think we already suffered quite a few weather-related disasters on ourselves as well. But of course, even more in our neighborhood, Mediterranean bases, Middle East, even though, of course, there are always multiple reasons for that very turbulent developments in our neighborhood. But clearly the climate change is one of them. When we look at the situation in Syria, let's not forget that for 20 years there is unprecedented drought. The people been deserting their traditional places of living. They've been overcrowding cities. They've been simply trying to make the living in a different way. And we know that in the end it led to this social and security explosion. And the potential for such a development is everywhere around our Mediterranean bases, and therefore I think we have to be very active there. We have to share our experience from renewables. We have to be ready to help the people on the ground there to also clearly be ready to share our knowledge, new technologies, and bring that experience to this country, so we would help them to fight the climate change there and to cooperate with us in this global effort.
I want to come back to that a bit later when we talk some about adaptation. Senator, White House, Admiral Samuel Locklear, who heads the U.S. Pacific Command, has said not too long ago that the #1 threat the U.S. faces in the Pacific comes from climate change. Would you agree with that rather strong assessment?
It's one of my favorite quotations, Melinda. I would say that there are 3 significant ways in which climate change cycles through the security concerns that are at the heart of this conference. The first is that the carbon pollution changes the chemistry of our oceans and changes the chemistry of our atmosphere. That in turn has effects in our forests, in our fisheries, and on farmland, which degrade their traditional uses and create suffering, disruption, dislocation, and ultimately climate refugees and violence. So that's a particularly dangerous cycle. A more positive linkage is that where the Russian power is applied to neighboring countries through its petropolitics, a powerful investment in clean energy can have a dilutive effect on that power and create alternatives to the monopoly. And there are huge upsides there if you compare the clean energy output of Ukraine, for instance, to the clean energy output of Germany. The geography is not that different from a solar and wind perspective, and there's a big upside there that has a strategic component. The last, of course, is that the power of American example is something that has been remarked on over our history. President Clinton used to say that the power of American example has always meant more in the world than any example of American power. That was not an original thought to him. That was an idea that comes from Daniel Webster's famous Bunker Hill Address. At the moment, American democracy is being degraded and embarrassed by the, I think, malign influence of the fossil fuel industry. And as a result, it has more or less disabled any chance of bipartisan activity in the United States Congress. And there will come a time, I believe, when our failure to address this in a timely way as a result of mischievous intervention by a particular special interest will be a combination of factors that will not lead to a powerful example that we would prefer to be able to demonstrate.
You actually have a rather interesting proposal for how to deal with those malign influences, but I want to come back to that also a bit later. One more brief question, though. You are a member of the Bipartisan Senate Oceans Caucus, so I wonder if you could just say a word about the risks you see associated with rapid change in the Arctic.
The changes to the oceans are profound, and because we're terrestrial beasts, we tend not to be aware of them. But the ocean is acidifying at the fastest rate that it has since human beings have walked the earth. There are catastrophic indicators like the little sea butterfly called the pteropod, a little snail that is the base of the Pacific food chain. 50% of them have severe shell damage now because of the acidification of the seas around them. So what's happening up in the Arctic isn't just the loss of the traditional ecosystem, but as it melts, both the Arctic and Greenland and the Antarctic potentially have dozens of meters of sea level rise to contribute. I'm from Rhode Island. We're the ocean state. We're also the smallest state. We don't have a lot of land that we can give back to the ocean, so we're desperately interested in making sure that the sea level rise does not become multi-metric.
But Newport has really high cliffs.
Interestingly, it's actually some of the upland community, up bay communities that will be hurt more because their topography is flatter.
Yeah. Mr. Beta, your business is risk. In terms of security, what are the main threats that you see associated with climate change?
We have heard them before. We are most concerned about the drought and the loss of water in northern Africa, not just in the Middle East. By the way, Boko Haram is also an effect of migration that is uncontrolled after many, many years of drought and overpopulation and deforestation. So we've talked about it a lot, but it's now happening. And those people have not yet turned north, they're turning south at the moment. So when we worry about Syria, we should be starting worrying about many other countries where people might walk away from. So we have every interest to address that. The other one is, again, as you mentioned, the rising sea levels, but more importantly, the weather that is changing fundamentally is causing more and more damage. And just to remind everybody, only a fraction of that is insured and, in fact, is insurable. Because we can only insure where you have a proper pricing and description of risk. This is, by the way, the service we can provide to society, but we cannot do wonders.
Just because your company does a lot of numbers crunching, let me ask you to tell us how reliable you think the data are that we have right now on climate insecurity. For example, statistics and projections on ice melt. To what degree can we really rely on those?
We can't really rely on them, but what we can do is what we call no-regret moves. If people are building houses and cities in areas where we know that they'll be affected by tsunamis, that's something that we can prevent. We know that in Indonesia, there are more than 50 million people that live in areas where they shouldn't be living. So there's a lot that can be done without being statistically precise.
Thank you very much. Finally, Mr. Naidu, I asked Senator Whitehouse about the Arctic. The Arctic was a major topic during your term at Greenpeace, of course. Is that one of the main things that keeps you up at night, or are there other risks you would put on a par with that?
Well, the Arctic is critical because the Arctic sea ice serves as an air conditioner or a refrigerator of the planet. And so, it takes the edge off the harshness of the sun. And so when Hurricane Sandy happened, for example, for the first time we had American journalists actually talk about a polar vortex and an Arctic freeze. So, I'm an African and I've been arrested a couple of times in the Arctic for peaceful protests against oil rigs, and people back in Africa say, well, what is an African doing in the Arctic freezing his butt? But you know, the sad thing is what happens in the Arctic, as our American friend says, what happens in Vegas stays in Vegas. Sadly, what happens in the Arctic does not stay in the Arctic, and as the Senator correctly said, in the Antarctic as well, where I've just been 3 weeks ago. But I think you wanted this to be interactive, so I'm going to ask a question to the audience. How many of you, when that degrees are used, when they say 2 degrees and 1.5 degrees, because that was a big debate in Paris, whether the target should be set at 1.5 degrees of warming since the start of the industrial period versus 2 degrees. Let me ask you, how many of you know from the start of the industrial period till where we are now, how much of warming we've had already? Okay, keep your hand up. Okay, 1 person, okay? 2. Okay, let's see, what is it? 1 degree. Yeah, we're just about at 1 degree, okay? And at 1 degree, we are seeing the kinds of devastation that we have talked about already. In my continent, we are seeing drought has been spoken about, water security has been spoken about, but there's another thing, which is desertification, which means that land where people grow food is being eroded, as well as, of course, we're a continent surrounded by water. So I want to say very strongly here that the Paris Agreement is not an occasion for orgasmic delight, right? I want to say that it is, we took a position, many of the civil society groups like Greenpeace, to say let's not make, perfect the enemy of the good. So when the deal was done, we said this is a step in the positive direction, and we acknowledged it. However, we must be very clear that apart from saying that we need to implement with extreme urgency right now, you have to be very clear that it's inadequate. So what we are hoping is that if we can get the kind of urgent first steps to happen, then that hopefully will give governments the ambition and the courage to actually ramp up their commitments, because we've built into the Paris Agreement, thankfully, a ramp-up mechanism where every 5 years governments will come together and look at picking up the ambition. But just be very clear, if you think Paris Agreement has solved the climate crisis, then you are kidding yourself.
Thanks very much, and let's go exactly to that topic now. President Aliyev, your intended nationally determined contribution, as it's called under the Paris Agreement, the INDC, has listed various measures to modernize the energy sector. But if your country really takes Paris seriously, must it not make a far greater effort to diversify out of energy than it's already doing? I think energy accounts for 70% of your country's income.
We are working on that, but one thing we must not forget, that when Azerbaijan became independent, economy was completely devastated. It was endemic poverty and stagnation. Therefore, for us, the only way to find ourselves on the world map was to use our energy resources for development of the country. Therefore, less than 3 years after restoration of independence in 1994, we invited major energy companies of the world to come and to invest. And that was for the first time when the Caspian Sea was an area of direct involvement of European and American oil companies. For us, then, energy security and energy policy was a way to modernize, to diversify, and to invest in infrastructure. Because the money which we accumulated from oil sales were kept in the sovereign wealth fund, and at the same time invested in infrastructure to reduce dependence on oil. And as a result of that policy of diversification, today more than 70% of our GDP is already non-oil sector. Of course, we depend on oil prices with respect to our export. Export is 90% oil and gas, and we are now implementing the large-scale reforms, including privatization, diversification of economy, improvement of business climate, in order to reduce dependence on oil and gas. And by the way, the drastic drop of the oil prices 4 times for us was another, opportunity to invest more in technology, in non-oil economy, in agriculture, in ICT. And if we succeed in all our plans, I'm sure that in the coming years, Azerbaijan will be completely independent from oil prices. As I said recently, post-oil period of Azerbaijan already started because of the low oil price, and we must find our way on the global market as a country which exports not only oil and gas, but other products.
But interestingly enough, your nationally determined contribution in fact mentions as a major potential constraint falling oil prices, that would impede your ability to fulfill your self-declared goals.
Well, of course, it will influence our income, but at the same time, I think it will make us more committed to reforms, and the future development of Azerbaijan will not be related to the price of oil or volumes of production. Though today we're implementing the project of Southern Gas Corridor, which will generate additional thousands of 10,000s of jobs, and which will allow Europe to diversify. And by the way, Europe will get additional volumes of natural gas and thus also reduce greenhouse carbon emissions. This is a project of energy security, diversification of not only routes but by also sources, and a project which will bring benefits to us, producers, transitors, and consumers.
Speaking of the Southern Gas Corridor, let me go to Vice President Šefčovič. As I mentioned in your introduction, you are responsible for triangulating these 3 pillars of EU energy policy: sustainability, affordability, and energy security. 3 different goals, as I said, also not always compatible. Has the Paris Agreement changed anything about the way you prioritize in that triangulation? And perhaps to put it more bluntly, what do you say to critics who say the energy union is far too focused on gas?
I think that the best response is always in the concrete deeds, and I think therefore the whole effort which we will be deliver this year will clearly demonstrate that. Yeah, because from one side, when we've been discussing the creation of the energy union, the truth is that one of the predominant preoccupation of the Europeans was the security of supply, because we still have very fresh memories on 2006, 2009, and how our economy suffered where the supplies of gas were suddenly halted. But at the same time, it was also quite clear that to have sound policies, we cannot continue in a divided way to deal with energy on Monday, with climate on Tuesday, with greenhouse gas emissions on Wednesday, and then to look what we can do with energy efficiency on Thursday. That actually we have to have policies which would work in a holistic manner. And therefore, we will see that very soon, within a couple of weeks, we'll come with our assessment of Paris. We'll be very serious with our INDC. I'm sure that we would overachieve our EU 2020 goals. I'm sure that we will overachieve our EU 2030 goals. And this year, we will put on the table concrete legislative proposals in energy efficiency, communication on the decarbonization of transport, better performance of our buildings, and reduction of the greenhouse gas emissions from agriculture. So all that is as a work on the outcome of Paris, which we very much welcome, and I totally agree with my colleague here that 5-year cycle was absolutely inevitable, because now I think we did what we could. Europe is very glad that we would not be that lonely leader in this effort, that other major economies are going to join us. But it's also quite clear that after INDCs are deposited, after they start to be implemented, we need to have this 5-year cycle where we look, where we verify, where we monitor if we are really meeting our targets, where we would check how much more we can contribute to fighting climate change, what the new technology is bringing us, and also to make sure that those who will not be delivered would be pointed out, and that we will be looking for the ways how to make sure that the global community would definitely deliver on the commitment from Paris.
Mr. Naidu, Greenpeace probably wouldn't be too surprised to hear that the EU will overachieve those 2020 goals because Greenpeace called them some time ago shamefully unambitious. If, in fact, Europe wants to set an example, as Senator Whitehouse said the U.S. also needs to do, what is the single most important step that Europe would need to take on energy?
I think Europe needs to do what everybody else needs to do, right? And that is to recognize that burning of oil, coal, and gas is killing our children's future, to put it in a blunt way. So therefore, any new, fresh investments that go into oil, coal, and gas must be understood as actually negative investments that actually is not what we need. Thomas Friedman, a US journalist, columnist, once said, when we think about the successful countries and companies of the future, he said, forget about the arms race, the space race, or any other race. The successful companies and countries of the future will be those that get as far ahead of the green technology race now, right? And I think that Europe, to be fair, has been, if you want, a global environmental champion for a long time. And why we were critical of those targets was that, as you correctly say, you're going to overshoot it. We knew you're going to overshoot it. Even if you didn't want to overshoot it, you know, the context has been laid there over the last decades. So I think Europe needs to, continue to lead by example, because we need blocks of countries and big countries to actually step forward and actually show that, in fact, we can make the transition from an economy that is dependent on dirty, brown, fossil fuel-based energy to an economy that is driven by green, renewable, clean energy, and that we can do that in a way that is, in fact, not harmful to our economies, but in fact, there are many studies that have been done now that show that the job creation potential, if we did this smartly, creatively, and thoughtfully, will actually exceed the kinds of jobs that would be created by clinging on to fossil fuel-based investments. So I think we would say to Europe and to China and the US in particular, I think if China, US, and Europe, and of course India, actually stepped forward and made seismic, massive leaps forward to clean energy in a rapid time, the rest of the world would follow. And that's what we need. We need an investment, shifts in investment. And I should just say quickly in conclusion, that one of the things that I'm putting my energies in together with a range of people is not focusing so much on companies that destroy forests or destroy oceans and expanding in fossil fuels, which is what Greenpeace and other organizations we've always done. We've campaigned against the companies that actually do the bad thing. And we're going to turn our energy now to the banking and the financial sector that actually funds those companies so that we can actually get faster progress. Because we have to recognize that the climate clock is completely against us and it's ticking down to midnight very, very fast.
We're going to hear a voice from that financial sector in a manner of speaking in just a moment. But Senator Whitehouse, something seismic did just happen in the U.S. The U.S. Supreme Court decided that President Obama's attempt to impose emissions controls on coal-burning power plants by executive order are not legal. And, or at least that we will take a break while they're being challenged in court. How can we possibly expect China and India to go ahead with fulfilling their nationally determined contributions when the U.S. clearly is not in a position to pass the legislation that would be required to fulfill its own?
Let me say two things about that. First, I don't think that the Supreme Court decision is anywhere near as significant as certain interests are touting it. It's a stay that will just be a matter of months. Many of the states which were participating in the Clean Power Plan are going to continue to anyway. It's only effective with respect to the coalition of the unwilling, and I think what they will begin to see as they get further left behind is that this was a foolish intervention by the Supreme Court from the point of view of trying to help the fossil fuel industry and those states. It just was bad judgment on their part in terms of its ability to achieve their apparently intended goal. So I think they sent a signal from a point of view of my confidence in the court. It was another seismic event after Bush versus Gore and Citizens United. But in terms of how the energy issue plays out, I don't think it's going to make a very big difference. I also think that there is enormous Republican support within the Congress for a proper response to carbon pollution, and it is being held back by political threats and bullying by the fossil fuel industry, to the extent that talking to many of my colleagues of it is like talking to a prisoner about organizing a jailbreak. You have to have the conversation when the guards aren't looking. But I don't think that can last. When you have the stress in the oil industry, for instance, where the CEOs of Exxon and BP and Shell are all saying we need a carbon fee, how long can their lobbying groups continue to fight violently against a carbon fee? I mean, it's dishonest, and ultimately the dishonesty has to collapse, and it's going to collapse in the direction of getting something done.
You did have that, as I said, intriguing proposal for how one might bring some of that dishonesty, or an economist would say, unwillingness to internalize costs that indeed will be borne by future generations. Your proposal was essentially to treat the oil companies like the tobacco companies. Can you just tell us a brief word about that and whether this really could fly?
The history is that the American Department of Justice brought a civil action against the tobacco industry because its campaign of disinformation about what smoking did to your health was dishonest to the point of being fraudulent. They won that case in federal court, and the academic studies and the investigative journalism that has looked at the campaign to deny that carbon pollution causes climate change has over and over again been seen as being an equivalent dishonest and erroneous operation, and indeed many of the same players who were involved in the tobacco scam are actually active in the climate change scam. So it's not only the same strategy, it's the same organizations and people in some cases. So if the Department of Justice wanted to bring that case, I think that they would win it.
We do like to do things in the U.S. via litigation, so...
When all else fails, that's why the Founding Fathers put juries into the Constitution.
Mr. Beta, Mr. Naidu suggested financial sector has a huge role to play. In fact, you made very big seismic headlines last year by promising to cull coal investments from your portfolio to the tune of 225 million euros, and the deadline you set was next month, quite a short period of time well, that's what I read. Is it wrong?
Yeah, it's a bit larger than 225 million. I'll talk about it in a second.
Okay, very good. In any event, divestment is gaining in popularity. Some market experts say engagement and working with companies from the inside might have more punch, might actually achieve more. Do you think that's right? How far will divestment get us in terms of weaning ourselves off of fossil fuels?
Thanks for the question. I'd like to support the comments that we've heard before, that the financial industry does have a responsibility, which we in the past did not assume. So it's very important. The second one is it also has to follow us step by step. So you need to push, when you're at Greenpeace, you need to push us. What we need is a stable path, right? So we cannot have every 12 months a new regulation. We make investments for decades, so we need something to count on. So these agreements, like we had them in Paris, are very important, but it's also important to keep them and to have legal security that when we make investments into, by the way, energy, we can rely on the rule of law for the returns of our savers. I just wanted to mention that because the instability that we've seen in legal environments around where do we invest in energy are creating a problem like they are in Europe when you have to differentiate between generating power and the investing into the networks for investors like us don't make any sense. But let me get back to the point. What we said, by the way, before Paris is the first time that business is actually pushing government not governments is pushing business. I think it's the first time in our history that we had to convince policymakers to go the step and make the commitments. And it used to be the other way around, that we were seen to be not willing to contribute. I think that's very important. Second, it's also no more parts of the society that are doing it. It's more and more business leaders joining up together and saying, how do we get this done? Despite the fact, obviously, if you're an oil producer, you have a vested interest, and you're not going to be the first one saying, I'm polluting the world, right? So that would be a little bit unrealistic. Now, what are we doing? We're not just disinvesting from coal, where producers have more than 30% in coal, which is about 5 billion in debt, and we only had 225 million in equity because we started in 2004 already to disinvest, and we'll do more. We have 37 criteria we're applying to our 650 billion of insurance assets and the 2 trillion we run for third parties over the next few years to bring criteria as transparency, corruption, sustainability of business model into the investment criteria for the money then we invest on behalf of our saviors. So we're trying to have a sustainable approach for investment, and it's going to hit the fossil industry step by step. But we also need them to have some time to adjust to the new environment. Everything else doesn't work in economics.
And this idea that engagement from within, bringing pressure to bear, possibly could be more effective than simply bailing out of some industries. Is there anything to that?
It's very difficult. I'm not in the business of running oil companies, but we are in the business of responsibly investing the money of our savers, and we will not invest in business models that we don't believe have any future and invest in others. And by the way, we would like to have more regulatory support to invest in clean energy. Today, if I want to invest in a startup, I have to charge 50% of the money we invest in terms of risk capital. So I wish that some regulators and policymakers would connect the left-hand side of the brain that wants a safer financial system with the right-hand side of the brain that wants more investment in sustainable energy. That's one observation. The second one, if I may add to that, is it's also not our job to say, you know, what is the right business model to work? I would like to add to a point. Yes, you can say don't invest in oil and gas, but there's a huge difference between efficient gas plants and gas turbines and inefficient. There's a way to make existing coal plants a lot more efficient and less polluting than they are today. So we are investing in actually technology that helps to make Chinese coal plants a lot less polluting than they are today.
Thank you very much. I want to take audience questions in just a moment, but I'd like to just briefly talk about the other side of how we get ready for those climate security risks, and that is adaptation, because clearly, even in the best case scenario for Paris, we are going to see temperatures rise, and we are going to see dislocation as a result of all the different risks that we talked about. So, focusing on adaptation, again, I'd like to ask you, President Aliyev, a lot of money flowing into mitigation, but is enough flowing into adaptation to help countries like Azerbaijan? I think your country has estimated the cost for adaptation as at least 3 billion euros, if not much more. Are you seeing the help you need?
Actually, Azerbaijan's policies in general is that we must spend less than we earn. And the major investment projects, including investment in energy, were mainly based on our own financial resources and resources of our partners. Therefore, we do not expect any kind of substantial financial assistance, taking into account that during the recent time, Azerbaijan has accumulated substantial financial resources, and even the drastic drop of oil did not influence our economic development. Last year we had more than 1% growth of GDP and more than 8% growth in non-oil industry. That was mainly due to the policy of diversification and investments in non-oil infrastructure. Therefore, for us, of course, in general situation in the region is important. Sustainable development is our goal and target. And with respect to the issue related to climate change, as I mentioned in the beginning of my remarks, though we are not, we don't have obligations under the Kyoto Protocol, but our economic policy, investments in renewable sources of energy, building more than 10 hydropower stations, all that is our contribution. And again, if we did not invest, for instance, together with our partners in oil and gas, today our power stations would have worked as they used during the Soviet times, burning fuel oil. Today, all our power stations are either using natural gas or water. So this is investments in energy sector, which in its turn positively influence the reduction of carbon gas emissions. All these issues are interconnected, and of course we will continue to play our important role in managing these risks.
Vice President Šefčovič, interconnected is certainly the operative word when it comes to Europe. It has never been so aware of the fragility of its neighborhood, I think, as in the past year. If indeed we see sea level rise, drought, desertification, all the things we're talking about, what can we do to minimize dislocation and, of course, with dislocation, migration out of fragile regions? Surely Europe could do more than it's doing now.
Yeah, I think that it was quite clear that all this had to be discussed in a greater detail when we were discussing all these issues in Paris. And therefore, we always put, I would say, equal focus on mitigation, but also adaptation, because you're right, not everything could be resolved through the mitigation, even though we wanted that every single party to the Paris Agreement would show some effort, would show that they are determined to help the global community to achieve its goals. And just to comment a little bit to our previous part of the discussion, I think that Europe showed that the decoupling of growth and greenhouse gas emission is possible. Since 1990, I think we're only major economy which grew by 46%, and at the same time we managed to decrease our greenhouse gas emission by 24%. So we show that it's possible, and I agree with you that we also clearly demonstrate you can create new green jobs, which on top of it are local jobs, because very often if it comes to isolations, energy efficiency measures, these are usually done by the local SMEs. These are not some kind of global corporations which are behind this project. So it has a business sense, and this is what I think we need to talk more about with a greater visibility and greater voice, and therefore I think that financial help in having financial analysis and financial institutions supporting this approach would be very important. But if it comes to a question of the adaptation, of course, there are several measures which should be done, and I think that we have to work with our neighbors, with the countries in the developing world much more closely on these issues, because very often we see that our development aid is not used as efficient as we should, especially if it comes to this area. And very often the simple measures are the best one, as it was said, just to make sure that people will not build their houses where very clearly they could be affected by the climate change. But at the same time, very often what is needed to invest more in education, to invest more in the technology sharing, to make sure that we would be more resilient cities, villages, and we would invest more in more resilient crops. And all this, I think, will need to be done, and we will try to make sure that that mainstreaming of the budget, which we did for us Europeans, meaning that 20% of our budget, so 20% of $1 trillion within these 7 years, has to go to the climate-related, green-related policies, will also be implemented in our external aid, in our external financial support, and that I believe will help us to make a change. Let's not forget that we agreed in Paris that we will contribute as of 2020 by 100 billion of financial transfers from the developed to the developing world, technology-wise, private companies, of course, development, official aid, member states of the European Union. It will be big common effort, and I think that in that course of that implementation and spending of this enormous amount of money, we'll find the most efficient way how to mitigate and adapt the world to the climate change.
Mr. Naidu, one of the partial successes, at least in Paris, was somewhat higher commitment on that climate finance that was just mentioned. Prior to Paris, we weren't doing too well at all on our 2009 goal of getting the 100 billion together by 2020. Are those commitments going to be realized, do you think?
Well, they have to be realized. We don't have a choice, actually. Because, well, firstly, just speaking as somebody from the developing world, we want to be very clear. When we have been asking for these resources to be put in the Green Climate Fund to help countries, we're not asking for charity. We're asking for a repayment of a climate debt or a carbon debt. Because, one of the situations which is very unfortunate, and I'll say it because people don't like to hear it, but the reality that we are facing is what you could call climate apartheid. Because if you look at the demographic reality of which parts of the world that carry the biggest responsibility and which parts of the world that are paying the first and most brutal price, it's a very uncomfortable picture. Having said that, when we talk adaptation, there's what I would call two types of adaptation: micro-adaptation and macro-adaptation. Micro-adaptation, what I'm meaning there is like, how do we address sea level rise? How do we address changes in rainfall patterns to adapt agriculture? How do we think about water harvesting? These are big things, right? But why I introduced this issue of macro-adaptation is because humanity as a whole has to ask itself some really tough questions now. If our friends at Worldwide Fund for Nature, WWF, are correct, and I believe they are, when 10 years ago they brought out a report and they said, if we were to deliver the average lifestyle that folks in the United States and Europe take for granted and the elites in developing countries take for granted, then we would need between 5 and 8 planets. So part of the bigger adaptation question, and generally in the adaptation stuff in the climate, they don't talk about this, I'm just putting it in this way, that one of the things we have to address is the question of consumption. This planet is a finite planet. It cannot deliver on the scale. If we were to deliver the expectations that people at the top end of society have in terms of material consumption, we just do not have, the planet cannot do that. So I would say that, there's a bigger conversation that we have to insert in this conversation about what constitutes a happy life, what constitutes a decent level of material comfort and so on. And I want to be blunt about it. And people don't like to hear this as well, that if we think we can have the level of consumption that we have in the United States and Western Europe, for example, across the world, then we are kidding ourselves. And part of it has to be a conversation, unlike what President Bush Sr. said in the first climate negotiations in Rio in 1992, when he waved his finger and he said, the American way of life is non-negotiable. I think right now we have to say that all of us must be open to asking this question, because I end on good news, because this struggle is not about saving the planet. The planet actually does not need saving, because if we continue the way we are, what will happen is that we will warm up the planet where we will be gone, the planet will still be here. Right? And in fact, once we get out of the way, the forests will recover, the oceans will replenish, and so on. So let's be very clear that what is at stake here is protecting our children and their children's future. And however difficult, however complex the changes we need to make, the ethical imperative calls on us to make those changes.
Senator Whitehouse, Mr. Naidu just said, actually, climate finance from the West can be viewed as a repayment of damages. If we look at it in terms of an overall global carbon budget throughout history, that we in the West have consumed a great deal and then need to be putting back in. That surely would mandate for a larger U.S. contribution than what has been pledged, $800 million in climate finance over the next 5 years. Any likelihood whatsoever in seeing that number increased by the next administration, whoever it may be?
I suspect it's possible. All these things are, negotiable in legislative budgets. I think the focus here in a security conference should be that when you have a feeling of injustice on the part of people who are actually suffering, they have lost their fishery and their family is hungry. They have lost the farm because the crop they've grown forever no longer grows there. The forests that they have lived in have been wiped out by, in our case, it's beetles. But when you have these dramatic changes and the people involved feel that they have been treated unjustly, that is a situation that is bad for security. And when you add on to that they have to react to it, they have to move, they have to go take somebody else's resources, now you're starting to have competition, and that leads to violence. And pretty soon, when people get violent over these things, the United States has a role, the developed countries have a role. So the point that I would agree with Prime Minister Naidu is that it is in our interest to solve this problem. This is not charity and should not be seen as charity. This is a step in solving a common problem. And I would hope that the United States' contribution will be as much in leadership and technology in getting out of this as it is in compensation, because frankly, we're never going to be able to compensate our way out of this. The IMF says that the effective subsidy from damage that these fossil fuel companies do in the United States alone is $700 billion with a B dollars a year. We're never going to have $700 billion a year to adapt to that. We're never going to be able to put the money into the developing world to make up for that. We've got to address this as a solution, and now.
Thank you very much. Oliver Beta, clearly, even if we get the kind of fully funded Green Climate Fund that we need, we're going to require additional funds. How can you help to leverage that? And what role can insurance play? After the G7 met, there was an insurance initiative which Allianz, I think, co-founded. What exactly can you do, and how many people can you reach with that kind of insurance?
Again, there's sides. We are insurer and we are an investor. You can do both. The first one, from the insurance side, just put the facts on the table and show what can be done. So we can make the unknown known, and we can measure it and say what is at risk if we continue to build communities in coastal areas that are unprotected. What is going to happen if these droughts continue? So just give the facts, because often it's about fads and normative discussions rather than what actually happens. The second thing is we can actually help. We are, for example, part of RISE, which is an initiative that uses satellites to monitor crop growth in areas now on a 4x4 meter plant, and to help establish insurance for farmers in areas that where we are not able in the past to offer efficient insurance solutions, which is one of the biggest reasons for social unrest and distress, is when large areas lose their crops and they don't have any risk mitigation factors. And new technology can actually help there. And it's not about the financing, it's really technology. We can separate between fraud and real losses. We can separate between was it just bad farming or was it really a natural disaster. So just to give you an example, it can cover easily over 1 billion people in this world. The other thing that is very important is we can find out how to finance these businesses and with insurance protect them, by the way, against personal bankruptcies other than just their crops. So there's a lot that can be done. However, we cannot do it alone. We need governments to organize for that. In many countries, we don't have the legal frameworks to be able to do this. So there's a lot that can be done in public-private partnerships there. And then from the investment side, again, as I'd like to mention it, we would love to do a lot more. Despite all the volatility in capital markets, the world is flush with cash. So it's not about a lack of funding, it's a lack of ability to fund these resources to the right purposes, and our regulation at the moment is doing the opposite of what the political intent is.
Your regulation, meaning we need changes in policy and regulatory frameworks to unlock that capital. Solvency II?
That's one, but there are a few others. The most important thing is we need to be able to invest for the long term and sustain short-term volatility. By the way, that's our business model. We're not a bank.
Thank you very much. So let me now go to the audience, and by tradition, a Munich young leader asks the first question, and I was told that in this case it would be Martin Wilk. Is he in the room? There he is. He is the foreign policy advisor to German Member of Parliament Friedhof Schmidt, and so we're looking forward to hearing your question. Please.
Yeah, thank you very much. I'm Martin Wick. I'm with the Green Party, and I also want to refer on the discussion on mitigation and adaptation. Speaking about climate security, it's obvious that LDCs, low developed countries, already suffer under the negative effects of the climate change more than other countries. And this was already mentioned, but this may become a huge risk in the future, a huge security risk. And don't you think, and this is a question to the whole panel, don't you think it should be therefore an absolute priority for security politics to help LDCs to adapt concrete steps to prevent them from negative effects on climate change that had already taken place? Thank you.
The answer to that is yes, and you need to go back to 2004 and don't listen to Greenpeace or any civil society climate organization. Listen to the Pentagon, because in 2004 a report was done, commissioned by the Pentagon, which President Bush sadly buried for quite a while, which actually said in the coming decades the biggest threat to peace, security and stability will not come from conventional threats, and in fact would not even come from terrorism, but will come from the impacts of climate change. And we are seeing that in many parts of the world. Darfur in Sudan, the genocide that we saw there, was, as Ban Ki-moon says, one of the first major resource wars brought around by climate impact. So we need to understand that investment in addressing climate is an investment in addressing security on a long term. And if you look at the United States, for example, many of the senior former military leadership, right, are in fact some of the most eloquent voices on climate. They get it, they see it, and likewise you look around the world, increasingly people in the military establishments are actually raising the same call. So you're absolutely right. We have to actually do that with much greater urgency and with the sense that time is running out.
To add to the official record, it's been in our Department of Defense quadrennial defense reviews for at least a decade. The intelligence reviews that our intelligence committee put together point to this as a significant threat, and anybody with a sense of humanity and logic can figure out that if a lot of people are suffering as a result of a cause not of their own making, they will resent it. And when we were here 2 years ago, we had a private meeting with Secretary Kissinger, our delegation, and Secretary Kissinger said a phrase that I can still remember to this day: the great revolutions and upheavals in history have always come as the result of a confluence of resentments. And we are creating an enormous confluence of resentments coming at us that has very significant long-term security ramifications.
I agree with both speakers, because I think what we see right now is that big parts of today's debate was related to the refugee crisis we have in Europe. And of course, until recent time, the refugee crisis has been usually triggered by the security threats, by war, by instability. But we see that over the last few years, more and more of the migratory pressure has been caused by the climate change. So we have now this new term of climate refugees is becoming more and more present. I think currently, if you look at any numbers coming from the States or from our analysis, just show that we have biggest movement of the people since the Second World War. And not only in Africa, not only in Europe, it takes place also in Asia, and very often this is just climate related. Simply, people cannot live any longer in the traditional traditional regions because they'll become unlivable. And of course, it's very difficult to measure how fast, where exactly, and how severe these changes and these pressures would be. But we know that it's already happening right now, and it could only get accelerated. So I think that the properly focused, assist and aid and concentrated effort clearly would be absolutely needed.
Thank you very much. I have a question over here.
Junior ambassador of the Munich Security Conference. It's another program similar to Young Leaders. And I also work for Jacques Delors Institute in Berlin. I have a question which I would like to address to you, Mr. Šefčovič. The American company Chenery is about to start its LNG exports, and there have been lots of talks of which role the LNG exports from the US are going to play in the EU. And I wanted to ask you, do the environmental impacts of the supply chain of shipping the LNG all the way from the US to, let's say, Lithuania? Lithuania was one of the countries which first signed quite a lot of supply contracts. Do the environmental damages, or the other way around, do the energy security gains outweigh the environmental damages? And if not, then are there any other diversification alternatives which would be more environmentally friendly than shipping LNG from the US? Thank you.
Thank you very much for this question, and especially that you put it in a very interesting way. I think that when I started with my first intervention, I was describing that one of the reasons for creating the energy union was actually the security of supply concerns. And one of the decisions we've taken is that if you want to have reliable, sustainable and secure and affordable energy in Europe, we have to diversify the energy supplies. Currently, we see that LNG is becoming a very important factor. I mean, the assessment is that within the next 5 years, we will see 50% more of the gas coming to the global markets in the form of LNG, because there is this big development in the US, in Canada, in Australia. In our assessment, we are also evaluating that by 2030 we would need roughly the same volume of gas as we need today in Europe. Why? Because we believe that coal will be gradually replaced, because gas pollutes 50% less than coal, because we would need more of a reserve capacity for more renewables, because renewables, especially solar and wind, are intermittent power, which needs to have this reserve backup, which is very well performed, but by very efficient, if they're very efficient gas power stations. And we also believe that lots of oil will be replaced in transport, especially in heavy trucks, lorries, but also in the shipping, which would also make the shipping across the ocean cleaner than what we have today, where very often heavy oils are used. So we describe the gas as a very important transitional fuels, which should help us to prepare ourselves better for the low-carbon society. We have very clear roadmap for 2030, for 2050. Let's not forget that by then we agreed in Paris that we would reduce our greenhouse gas emission as a global community by 90%. And of course, that would require enormous changing. But we need to prepare for that. We need to develop new technologies. We have to develop more renewables. And for that, we think that the matching fuel should be as clean as possible, and gas is clearly cleaner than the coal.
Thanks very much. I had a question here in the second row.
Thank you very much. Isabel Hilton, I run a China Dialogue, which does climate change and environment. On the question of where Paris got us to with the cumulative INDCs, it gets us to about 3.5 degrees. To get to 1.5 degrees, we're going to have to bend that curve really very rapidly indeed. And it seems to me that the kind of impacts that the Senator is talking about on the oceans, we may already be kind of into ecosystem collapse in the oceans, which are, of course, not part of the climate negotiations. The other tipping point, which hasn't come up, but which might bear on this is the melting permafrost and the release of methane, at which point it seems to me that all possibilities of mitigation are pretty much off. At a conference on security where we are looking at these very, very stark scenarios, it still seems to me that the traditional security discussion hasn't quite taken on board what we're looking at, and that there is still not quite a language to address this. It's better than it was. At least, climate security has entered the language, but it hasn't really entered the discussion quite as it might. And I just wondered how we might perhaps make that leap, because unless we do, we're not going to be able to act as drastically and as rapidly as we need. In a 1.5 degree pathway, I think we need to peak emissions by 2030. Am I right? I'm trying to remember exactly, but it is way ahead of the existing pathways.
Senator Whitehouse, you had your microphone ready to...
Two quick things. One, I think that I'm a believer in market economies, and the present market economy bakes a huge subsidy in favor of fossil fuel. If you can correct that, then in a million different decisions every day, people will be moving away, and you don't require as much regulatory and government and mandate, weight, and oversight. So there's a solution at hand, I think, that can make a very, very big difference in accelerating that curve. The second thing is, I just think it's so important that the Munich Security Conference has begun to allow this conversation into the security discussion. Security is not hurt just when something detonates. And the things that drive suffering cause insecurity, and we can predict with very great clarity what is going to happen to an Azerbaijani shepherd when his flock can no longer water, what is going to happen to a Vietnamese rice farmer when inundation puts too much salt into their land. You can go on and on and on, and what we have to do is to break the bubble that we're in. We're a very highly developed society. I can go to the market and I can buy strawberries, and if the place where they come from can no longer make them, then they'll come from someplace else, and they may be 50 cents cheaper, and I go on about my life, and for 50 cents, I don't notice. So many of us here at this conference are in that consumption bubble where we don't feel the day-to-day pain of people who still subsist. And that, I think, is part of what needs to be brought into the equation, because their day-to-day pain is explosive when it is brought into large groups and creates new conflicts.
Thank you very much. I had a question over here.
Thank you, Madam Moderator. I'm from the Ministry of Foreign Affairs of Armenia, and my question goes to President Aliyev. Mr. President, you blamed Armenia of polluting water and other serious political things on which we in Armenia have very different opposite views. How would you explain that for everything bad happening in Azerbaijan, Azerbaijan blames Armenia? Like, for example, when international community criticizes Azerbaijan for human rights record, Azerbaijan blames Armenia. When Parliamentary Assembly of Council of Europe and European Parliament adopt critical resolutions on Azerbaijan, again, Azerbaijan criticizes Armenia and Armenian lobby. And even then, oil production was reduced in Azerbaijan. British Petroleum was criticized for conspiring with Armenia. Mr. President, is it easier to have one universal answer to all difficult questions? As far as the water...
Thank you. Let's cut the question off right there and let him answer. Thank you very much. President.
First of all, I'd like to say that the ideas which you introduced in your question are absolutely wrong. We do not blame Armenia for those reasons which you mentioned. First of all, not only Azerbaijan, but Armenia is criticized by Council of Europe, by European Parliament, for very severe violations of human rights, falsification of presidential and parliamentary elections, and many other things which your government committed. We are blaming Armenia for occupation. And it's not only us, it's Security Council of United Nations, the highest international body, adopted 4 resolutions demanding immediate and unconditional withdrawal of Armenian forces from occupied territories. We are blaming Armenian government, not Armenian people, for genocide in Khojaly, where innocent civilians were killed by Armenian gangs only because they are Azerbaijanis. And this genocide is recognized by more than 10 countries. We are blaming Armenia for suffering of million refugees and IDPs who became refugees on their own land. 40,000 from Nagorno-Karabakh, 750,000 from other occupied territories of Azerbaijan, and 200,000 Azerbaijanis who were expelled and ethnically cleansed from Armenia. These are all the results of your occupation. This is a result of your policy towards neighboring country, and the occupation must be stopped. In order to achieve peace in the region, first condition, stop occupation of Azerbaijani lands.
President Aliyev, let me ask you, and in a way it's the other side of the question I posed at the outset of the discussion. There are some who believe that working on concrete cooperation in the area of water could be confidence building and a step toward greater cooperation on some of those other issues. Do you think that's right?
Well, of course, the resolution which was adopted less than a month ago in Strasbourg by the Parliamentary Assembly of the Council of Europe actually points out a very important element in this issue, and it particularly puts responsibility on Armenia for the problems they create with respect to management of water resources. Therefore, in order to establish a cooperation between Armenia and Azerbaijan, the process of deoccupation must start. And the best confidence-building measures will be start the occupation. Because not only Nagorno-Karabakh, which is a historic part of Azerbaijan, but 7 districts surrounding Nagorno-Karabakh are completely destroyed. And occupation lasts for more than 20 years. Armenia wants to keep the status quo unchanged. We want to change the status quo. So first step, beginning of the occupation of the territories, and then we will start cooperation.
Thank you very much. I had a question here.
Yeah, I'm really glad that we have this conversation in the Munich Security Conference. My name is Birgitta Jónsdóttir. I am a leader of the Pirate Party in Iceland. And we're very much aware of climate change there because we're feeling it. But I was a part of the climate conference in Paris, and one of the things that I was deeply disappointed with was that there was no discussion of meat. And meat consumption is said to have a massive amount of influence on the rising of the climate change. And I wanted to hear if anyone in this panel knows why meat was not put into the contract. And also, there was not a single word about the tar sands in Canada, nor fracking, which is a huge problem as well. So does anybody have insight why? And then one final thing, we have to change the way we consume. And I really thank those that have talked about this in the panel, about addressing that issue.
I think the short answer is that it's as the Senator mentioned in the context of the US, it's the power of the lobbying of the industries that are benefiting from the current situation. But also, I think it is putting your finger on the consumption issue again. It is not easy to talk about the kind of massive changes that we need to make, about how we think about what we eat, where it comes from, how we entertain ourselves, what kind of holidays we take. All of these things actually are very painful to talk about, okay? And I think that the political courage was not there. And sadly, I think part of the problem with Paris and all these climate negotiations and all the conversations on climate is that people don't seem to accept that nature does not negotiate, that we cannot change the science. We can only change political will. That is the only thing that humanity has within its grasp to change. So, you know, there's a call here for us also to recognize that this is a moral conversation. I think the senator said some eloquent things on bringing the morality into the conversation, and I would support that. And so when we talk about the goals that were set in Paris, let me just clarify that in 2018, there will be an interim review of the targets. And then after that, every 5 years, we'll have a ratcheting up mechanism. And to my friend from Allianz, I would say, I have a lot of sympathy with you and the industry, because unless governments provide regulatory clarity, it is difficult for business leaders to actually make the bold decisions and changes that they need to make on a long-term basis. But I want to just conclude with an optimistic note about what the senator said about subsidies. Well, he didn't use the term subsidies, maybe, but
Oh, I used that word.
you used the word. Okay, so let's just be very clear. We, with direct subsidies, right, we're talking about close to $1 trillion a year of taxpayer-funded money that goes towards supporting the fossil fuel industries. Good news is G20 already in 2009 agreed, right? The G20 leaders agreed that we must scrap fossil fuel subsidies. They agreed it in terms of the principle of it. But in fact, that has not happened. And if you look at that money, if that money were to be transferred to sustainable agriculture, to renewable energy, and so on, you could have progress much, much faster. So one of the things we also have to fight for is the scrapping of fossil fuel subsidies as fast as possible, so that a whole range of other economic activity that is climate friendly can actually prosper.
Let me just push back very gently on one point, which is that I don't want to leave the impression that mankind must suffer in order to make these changes. The changes in consumption can actually be enjoyable and beneficial. If you trade in your Mercedes for a Tesla, your quality of life just went up.
Even better for a bicycle.
On the other hand,
We're not sure we're going to invite him back, but never mind. Kidding
If
aside.
you trade in your Volvo for a Tesla,
Much better. Much better.
If the Tesla is powered by clean energy, yeah?
Yeah, but they're making a very important point. It's really not true that you have to suffer for changing lifestyle and habits. But I'd like to reiterate one point, and that is related to another subject. We need really prioritization and then the execution. It's exactly as you say, we continuously, and I'm not a politician, we have to manage things, right? So we have very few analysis and policy decisions, then we have to execute. So I cannot talk about being a politician, but maybe a little bit about execution. If you have constantly changing targets and constantly changing priorities, nothing happens, right? And if it's always the next election, then it's tough. So I don't know how you do it from a legal standpoint. Just lock in some of these things and let's do them. By the way, populations are willing to do a lot of things. In Germany now, on average, the German household is paying 30% more for energy than the neighboring countries and 60% more than American households. We are doing this because we believe in the change, but you cannot continue to pile up on that. You need to have a clear roadmap and say, this is the first step, this is the second step, this is the third step, and let's stick to that.
I had one last question, very brief, if you would, please.
Thank you. I'm Tigran Mkrtchyan, I'm from Armenia also, and my question is emanating from the comment to...
Is it about climate security?
It's about the answer of President Aliyev.
No, I'm sorry, going to cut it off.
Yeah, but,
I'm going to cut it off. Our topic on the panel is climate security. Please address him then after the panel ends. Then let me say to all of you, many, many thanks for being with us. Many thanks to everybody in the audience for your contributions. And